This happened to my Aunt Clara about 20 years ago. She was a regular at a bowling club. As you can imagine, bowling isn't a super popular sport, but attracts its own unique crowd nonetheless. She usually got a lift from her husband, and was picked up at roughly around 10. However, on this night, her husband had been called back to work for an emergency at the plant where he worked. He was pissed, but it wasn't too much trouble for my aunt, because the walk back to her house was nothing more than about 15 minutes. She thanked all the members offering her rides, and said that she would be fine, as another member took her balls and said that he would bring them next time. It's not like she could bowl when she was at her house anyway. So, she got her stuff and made her way home. And as the bowling alley was at the edge of town, it teetered off to become the sticks almost. She started her walk fairly pleasantly, and about halfway, she saw someone in the distance. She thought it was a guy trying to break into the car, so instinctively decided to cross the road and pretend not to notice. She tried to ignore him as much as possible, but he had no intention of ignoring her. He immediately stopped what he was doing, and my aunt said she heard a metallic clang as something fell to the ground, and heard the man literally run across the pavement and road over to her. He got right behind her, and she could hear his breath loud as he had just run a short distance, dangerously close to her neck. She was scared and unsure if she should turn around and say something or be polite, but chose to remain oblivious. Not 3 seconds had passed when my aunt felt his hand rest gently on her shoulder. She turned around, and he was there panting, and offered her a big smile, and said, "Hello, where are you off to?" She gave her a wry smile, and said that she was just making her way to see a friend. He looked at her, and she could see this kind of crazed look in his eyes. There was something weird about his pupils, but she couldn't really tell what. He said, "Can I come too? I need a friend tonight." She didn't really know what to say. On the one hand, she could be polite and try and lose him halfway there, and on the other, she could be rude and potentially face the consequences of a pissed off guy who she didn't know, who she was pretty sure she'd just seen trying to break into a vehicle with a crowbar. So she chose to be nice and said, "Of course." The guy smiled again and put his hand on her shoulder as they started walking. The man was a fair bit bigger than my aunt, so she relented and walked the death march with this creepy guy. She was no more than 5 minutes from her house and needed to find a way to lose him. Problem being, her house was on this very road, so there was no way for her to lose him really, unless she cut off another road and went around in a circle. But then what if he didn't follow? She'd lead him right back to where she didn't want him to be. All these thoughts entered her mind as she walked ever closer to her front door. She made a tactical move and just kept on walking. The guy was starting to get bored as my aunt wasn't saying much, and kept asking how far it was and if it would be much further. She said that it was just up here, and then picked a random house with all the lights off. She said that this is where her friend lived. She was getting desperate and feeling incredibly anxious. It was only 10. She knew some people could be in bed at this time, but she wished on her lucky stars that there'd be no one home. I'm not sure why. She knocked on the door with the guy in tow, waiting to see what would happen. There was no reply. After about 2 minutes of waiting in silence, the guy goes, "Looks like there's no one home." She turns back and says, "What night is it tonight?" He says, "Thursday." And she goes, "Oh man, there's me thinking that it was Friday. I'm so sorry, my friend. Well, no harm done. Looks like we won't be going anywhere after all. I better get home now. Hope you have a good night." And started walking along. But he caught up fairly quickly, unrelenting and unprepared to leave her be. "That's all right. Why don't we chill back at your place?" That's when things got creepier. His hand started descending her shoulder and all the way down to her waist. She instinctively slapped his hand off and told him that that wasn't cool, but he then gave a very, very angry look, and she started to feel very threatened. In a moment of panic, she dropped her purse intentionally so that things would start falling out. She saw a lipstick of hers begin rolling down the sidewalk, and as she was picking things up, she looked behind her and indicated to the guy, saying, "Oh darling, would you be a dear please and pick that up for me?" He thought about it for a moment, and then turned his back for a second to retrieve the fallen article. The moment that he had reached the lipstick, my aunt was already running at full speed with her bag towards her house. She didn't dare look back, but she also didn't dare to make her way home. When she found a street corner, she turned, stopped immediately, and needed to see where the creep was. She was about to peek her eye around the corner, but that's when she realized she didn't need to. She could hear the man furiously running as fast as he could behind her, and she decided to carry it on and kept up the chase. She ran around that street and made a perfect square and looked around again, and he was just a little off. She was running out of energy and completely terrified, and saw some bushes in a neighbour's garden. She lunged into the bushes and tried as best she could to remain completely silent. There she remained, holding her hands over her mouth, eyes wide in the dark, seeing if this creep would pass her. She heard him before she saw him. He was running like there was no stopping him, fortunately completely oblivious to her hiding spot, and ran straight past. Fortunately for her, he kept on going, and didn't seem to stop running even though he didn't see her. It took her about 20 minutes before she finally had the courage to even peep out of the bushes. She didn't hear anyone, and she didn't see anything, and she started walking back quietly, always looking behind her, in case she'd need to burst into a sprint once more. She finally reached the stairs of the house and ascended them quickly. She looked around, and she said that it was at this moment that all her fears returned, and that her heart dropped to her stomach. Out in the distance was the guy. He was watching, and he began running, and running, faster than before, towards the house. As cliché as this may sound, my aunt then dropped the keys, and was fumbling in her hands, shaking as she inserted them into the locks, and finally ran into the door. It took the guy about 10 more seconds before he started banging on the door. My aunt just stood at the other side of the door, trembling. She didn't know what to do. She was scared that the guy would go fetch his crowbar and make quick work of the door as well. When she finally gained her composure, with the guy still banging on the door, did she run to the phone and dial 911, and explained that a creep was banging on the door, and she was pretty sure she saw him trying to break into a car earlier. The operator insisted on staying on the line, and said that the police would be there soon to deal with this guy. She wasn't too far from the police station, and it only took about 3 minutes before she heard the whirl of sirens and the police approached the area. That's when the banging stopped, and the guy started running. It didn't take long for the police to catch him too. and my aunt kept in touch with them to be informed of the proceedings. As it turns out, this guy had just been released from prison not 2 weeks before. And what do you know? In that time, he'd already been linked to a robbery in the area, was trying to break into a motor vehicle, and was creeping on my aunt. She was always dropped off home after bowling, or taken back home by her husband. It's always sat with me, this story, because I, as a petite young woman, fear for my safety after dark, and hope to never encounter anyone like this. When I moved into our current house, I was around 8. This was back in 2005. I remember that we had this boring and very ugly front door. It was doubly annoying because the mechanism that locks the door in place was broken. You could continuously spin the doorknob in either direction and have it not open. So we took the mechanism out, and you would just need to push or pull the door in order to get it open. Now, I was about to head upstairs when I noticed that the doorknob was spinning. I pulled open the door to see who was on the other side, and there was no one. I closed the door and was about to turn around again when the doorknob continued to spin. This was only possible if someone was manually turning it. I opened the door once more, and there was no one on the other side. I stared at it in wonder when the door flew off its hinges and pushed my head into the corner of the wall. It split my head open, and I had to stay for several days at the hospital for a severe concussion. I told my parents that I just fell while holding onto the door when they asked me about it, because I knew that they wouldn't have believed me anyway. We had to replace the whole door frame, which we have today. Another story happened around 4 or 5 years later, and involved my brother and I. Around when I was about 12, me and my brother were hanging out in the office room in our house. It was about 3 a.m. when we heard a bell. Not just any bell, but a tricycle bell. Just think of an average bike bell. We freaked the hell out, because we were the only two in the house at the time. We looked around the house to not find a thing. The next night, I was alone in the office around the same time when I heard the small bell. I, scared out of my mind, used my glass cup as a makeshift weapon to defend myself as I patrolled around the house. When I got to the kitchen, the tricycle that I had when I was 8, that we sold at a garage sale before we moved into the current house, rolled across the floor. No one was downstairs at the time to roll it, or ring the bell for that matter. We still have the tricycle somewhere. Another story. So my mother works a maximum security prison. There was an inmate that tried to hang himself. She was walking in on him, and she pulled him down and performed CPR. She ended up getting his heart to start again, but the damage was already done. The man was brain dead. This traumatized her pretty bad, and she got minor PTSD from it. It was bad enough that she needed therapy. Fast forward about a year or so after the event, stuff started happening around the house. Papers would come flying out of our printer. Objects would fall over on their shelves, and the TV would turn on and off at random times. These events escalated until one night my mother woke up with her arm in pain. She looks over, and her husband is laying on her arm. She says, "Hey, wake up! You're on my arm." My stepfather nudges her arm some more. "What the hell? Get off my arm!" Now mind you, my mother had surgery on her arm in the past, and it's incredibly painful even to this day. So, she is in a lot of pain. She tries to push him off her, when she finally says, "Get off my arm, you're hurting me." At this point, my stepfather opens his eyes and turns over, so that all of his weight is pinning my mother's arm down. Except it wasn't my stepfather. This man had a tomato red face, black eyes, and a toothy smile that stretched to either ends of his face to his ear. Good. My mother proceeded to flip out and start crying to stop, and that she was terrified and to get off her arm. My mother eventually pries her arm out from under this intruder and runs downstairs. She wakes the kids up and takes them into the living room to prepare to call 911. My stepdad comes down to the living room, except he is himself. He is wondering what the hell is going on, and my mother is screaming, "Get out of my house, stay away from me and stay away from the kids." It was pretty intense. Eventually my mother saw that it was actually my stepdad and calmed down. It was around this point that she decided it was probably time that they got outside help. So they called my step-grandfather. My step-grandfather's wife has a brother that is a retired priest, and he currently lives somewhere in Mexico. By calling my step-grandpa, they got his contact info and invited him up to the States as a sort of consultant. He ended up flying up and listening to our story. He ended up saying that he heard of paranormal things happening to people in his line of work, but never to the extent that it was happening to us. He ended up giving us the contact information of a female pastor that travels around and deals with this stuff. He described her to us as someone who was especially sensitive to paranormal phenomena. He told us to just call her, tell her that he referred her to us, and to invite her over. Nothing more. He was specific about not telling her anything about what was happening, and that, as soon as she steps foot into the house, she'll immediately start to spout off stuff about your house's history, people who have died there and the like. So we give her a call. My mother followed the priest's instructions, and as they were saying their goodbyes, my pastor starts yelling, "Stop! Someone is trying to talk to you. She's extremely angry. She wants me to tell you that you moved it, and she wants you to put it back where it was, right now." And then she hung up. So, it just happened that my family was having a garage sale at the time. We moved some of the more useless stuff to the basement. One of these were these dolls. Now, these weren't just any dolls. These were vintage dolls from when my great-grandma was a girl, before she passed away. She was extremely adamant about my mother inheriting them. She was definitely the type of person to get angry over something like moving her possessions somewhere. As soon as the pastor hung up, she knew exactly what the pastor was talking about, and moved the dolls. Now, the thing with the pastor didn't quite work out. On the day that she was supposed to visit, the pastor forgot our address and phone number, and looked on her phone to contact us, except all of our contact information was erased. We ended up calling her later that day, gave her our number and address again, and she said that she was more than willing to still come over. At this point, she got into her car and it wouldn't start. She called a towing company to try and get to the shop so that it could be fixed, except the tow truck got into an accident on the way over to her house. Suffice to say, these were a coincidentally, or maybe not, long string of bad luck, so she was never able to come out. So since that didn't work out, we went to a different source for help. We called a paranormal investigation company that is local to our area. It was an interesting experience, to say the least. They came over and spent the night. They split up into groups and investigated a different part of my house. They had cameras, and these recorders that supposedly picked up on super low frequencies. One of the things that they caught floating somewhere in our guest room, as well as several orbs. They found a whole bunch of stuff on the voice recorders, and they interviewed, or so they say, 4 different entities. They identified a young girl, an older teenager, and a woman by the name of Lorelei, and a man named Frank. Now this caught my mother's attention, because it just so happened that the man that my mother resuscitated was called Frank. Upon more investigation, the man said that he liked my mother and hated my stepfather. That was about all that happened with that. For a while, the paranormal investigators became kind of famous within their community because they got a lot of evidence. So around this time is when I took some leave from the Navy and came back home. It was very quiet while I was there, except for one night. I was sitting in the living room reading, when I felt like someone was watching me. It got so bad that I actually went outside with a flashlight and started looking through bushes, because I was convinced that someone was stalking me. It ended up being nothing, and the feeling went away after a couple of hours. Fast forward to a couple of months ago. My uncle's childhood best friend, that we hadn't talked to in many years, stopped by for a barbecue. He had a new girlfriend. As soon as my family friend and his girlfriend stepped through the door, the woman stopped abruptly and asked my mother, "How many do you have?" My mother said, "I have 5 children. 4 are from me and the other is a stepdaughter." "No, that's not what I meant." My mother said uncertainly, "We have 4 ghosts. A little girl, a teenager, a woman, and a man." "No, you have at least 2 men. Because I have 2 brutes that are currently screaming in my face and telling me to get out." My mother and her had a very long conversation. Now, I would take what I'm about to tell you with a grain of salt. As soon as my mother told me this, I said, "No way. That's the most tall-tailed bullcrap I've ever heard." But you never know. Maybe I'm wrong. The woman told my mother that she's always had the ability to see ghosts all of her life, among other things, such as telekinetic abilities. She used to shatter light bulbs above her mother's head when she was a little girl. One day, her teacher was being mean to her. The next thing you know, the teacher is being lifted up off the air and pinned against the wall by some invisible force. She told us that she was then taken away by the government and had experiments performed on her to try and replicate the event. She said the government hadn't had contact with her in some time. Yeah, I'm not too sure about that last part, but whole sensitivity thing was obviously pretty consistent with our experiences. Something else that she told us was that the whole land around us was still haunted as hell. She said that the neighbours across from us have nothing less than an infestation, and she had never seen anything like it. She ended up leaving, and all of the paranormal events stopped. She later contacted my mother and mentioned that the two men that were shouting at her left with her, because they found out that she could see and hear them. They started messing with her by hiding her stuff under her bed and knocking things over. She told us that she could get rid of them though, and since then it's been quiet. No problems except for this one time that my mother was alone in her room, when the spring door stopper started randomly vibrating side to side. Not in the, oh, there must be a big truck that just shook the house kind of way. More the, this was someone pulling that thing to its full range of motion and letting it go, as if someone was playing with it. My mother remembered the little girl ghost that was at the house and said, "I know you're there, honey. It's okay if you want to play a bit. You can stay here as long as you're not mean." And that was that. I grew up in a small town in Texas. We lived in such a small town that everyone knew each other, and even if you didn't know someone's name, that at least their face was recognizable or familiar. Also, I grew up with 3 other siblings, and we would all walk to and from school together. At the time of this memory, I was a young 7-year-old boy, and I remember it clearly being an intensely hot day. For reasons I can't recall, I was walking home alone that day, which was highly unusual and rarely ever happened. We didn't live too far from the school, but we could take certain tucked away routes that we perceived as shortcuts. This particular route was occupied by just a few houses, and most of them were empty, so it was usually a very quiet, inactive area, with little chances you would even encounter cars driving by. I remember thinking it was so hot that day, and my backpack was so heavy, and I couldn't wait to get home. Halfway to my house, quietly out of nowhere, I hear a car slowly driving behind me. After walking for a while, I finally turned around to see it was a small black car, and I could barely see that there was more than one person in it. Being a very shy and anxious kid, I tried to ignore it and keep walking, but it continued to slowly trail behind me. Part of me thought that this was all a prank. When my family first moved to this small town, we would get teased a lot for being the only Asian family in town. After what seemed like the longest and most awkward minutes of slowly being followed, I started to feel uncomfortable. So I stopped walking and stepped further aside to see if they would just eventually pass me. Even at the time of this happening, I never thought I was in danger, because this small, quiet town was known for being very safe, and like I said, everyone knew each other. The car then slowly drove up to me and rolled down the passenger window. There were 3 young men in the car. They weren't teenagers and looked to be in their 20s. I remember being caught off guard by not recognizing any of them, which was very strange for this town. The guy in the passenger seat then said with a smile, "Hey, do you need a ride?" Still being ignorant and not sensing any danger, I thought it was so tempting, because it was so hot outside. Regardless of actually wanting to get in the car, I just said, "What?" He began to repeat, "Do you want a ride?" Then the guy in the back seat of the car began to open the back door and let me in as he grinned at me. Once again, even though I actually wanted a ride home, I just said, "What?" All 3 of them smiled and chuckled. The man again said, "Do you want a ride?" with a smile. At this point, I was so embarrassed and anxious once again I just said, "What?" The silence in the background was interrupted by the sound of a screen door opening in the distance. I could see a familiar elderly woman just looking at us from her door. Looking back, I think she did this to let them know of her presence and possibly scare them away, because this was obviously a very sketchy scene that she was witnessing. I turned back to look at the men. None of them was smiling anymore. They all looked serious. The guy in the passenger seat said so seriously and abruptly, "Get in the car." It almost felt like a scowl. I felt like I was being put on the spot and could feel a strange sense of urgency. So naturally I became even more nervous and once again just said, "What?" I then hear the woman's screen door shut, and the elderly woman was now standing on her porch, making her presence even more evident. The men were all clearly very annoyed, and the man in the passenger seat just said, "Forget it," as the guy in the back seat shut the door and they quickly drove off. Still being completely oblivious to the danger of the situation, I remember thinking as they drove off, "Dang it, I could have gotten a ride home," which is both funny and scary to think of today. I then turned to the elderly lady on her porch, and she gave me a gentle smile, and I shyly smiled back and continued to walk home. It was years later that I realized how shady of a situation this was, and I'm so grateful to the old woman who practically scared those strange men away. I was so close to willingly getting in their car, and if she wasn't there, who knows what these men could have done when they lost their patience. It gives me chills today to think of what may have happened if I got in the car with those strangers. So thank you, kind elderly woman, and to the 3 strangers in that black car, let's not meet again. Around 2012, I lived in the industrial part of a city where there weren't many houses around nearby. Just warehouses, trains, and some businesses scattered around. Even during the day it was rare to see people walking around, unless it was to or from the bus stop. One night, I was feeling off, like maybe my boyfriend and I had been arguing, or my roommates were getting on my nerves, and I decided that I needed to go for a walk. It was cold and late, past midnight. I just really needed some fresh air and time alone. I was a 21-year-old girl, who at that point in life wasn't very concerned about my own safety or well-being. I wouldn't say that I thought I was invincible, but I definitely did some careless and stupid stuff, and I'm lucky to have survived. This would qualify as one of those situations. I threw on my long trench coat, combat boots, a big fuzzy hat, and took off in a rush. There wasn't anything particularly scenic or pleasant around there, so I just went into the direction I knew best, towards the liquor store about half a mile away. As I approached the store, I reached into my pocket and realized that I had forgotten my wallet and phone. This store was closed anyway, so I just kept walking, still in the light of the neon liquor signs. I heard a car approach me and press on the brakes. I slowly looked over my shoulder to see the tip of my boyfriend's 90s silver Buick LeSabre moving alongside me. Relieved, I look to the driver's seat and see a man who is definitely not my boyfriend. He rolls down the window and says, "Get in the car." I was completely caught off guard, shocked, confused, and honestly kind of angry. "What? No," was my response, as I kept walking. He kept pace with me as I continued down the block. I kept looking over and finally told him to piss off, but he didn't do anything. He just kept right beside me, staring at me with the window down. Suddenly, he sped off, and a wave of relief washed over me. I really didn't know what to do next, so I cut around a corner and started walking in the opposite direction of the street back towards my house, towards the oncoming lane, in case he came back around, which he did. He would stop and then creep forward as I walked, all the while mumbling things to me. He definitely seemed to believe that I was going to get into the car with him, because he surely was not taking no for an answer. This time at least, there was a whole lane between us, but I really had nowhere to go. If I decided to take off running towards my house, there was only one way to get there, through the deserted industrial area, following on down the road, which led into a tunnel under the train tracks. He would be able to follow me right to my front door, with no witnesses, very easily. There was a 24-hour convenience store a mile in the other direction, but was that really my best option? I felt helpless. Out of nowhere, I heard the chattering sound of people in an unmarked building beside me. Without a second thought, I frantically pushed the door and entered a scene that I will never forget. A bunch of sweaty men smiling and speaking to each other in Italian, as they cheered and finished their beers as they packed up their ping-pong paddles. They all stopped and looked at me, and I shakily exclaimed, "There's a man outside following me, and I was really scared." It was silent for a second, as they all eyed one another suspiciously, but then one guy eventually offered me a ride home. I was so thankful to be in this stranger's fancy car for a whole minute and a half. I kept apologizing and thanking him. He was just kind of like, "It's okay, be safe, sketchy looking girl who just busted into our weekly tournament, you weirdo, please don't rob me." When I got home, I immediately looked up the non-emergency police line, but decided against calling, because like I said, the dude was in the exact same make, model and colour as my boyfriend's car, who was likely to be in the same exact area shortly. Looking back, I probably should have made the call. When said boyfriend did get home, he was furious with me that I put myself in that situation. Like, sure, that was a dumb move by me, but what about this guy who was lazily trying to kidnap me? Who the hell does that? So, scary man in the silver Buick, please, let's not meet. I hope no girls met him that night, or ever. And Italian dudes, thank you so much for having your hobby right next to where and when I needed you the most. I live in a major city, in practically the pit of hell state, born and raised here. I am very familiar with my surroundings. I'm also aware to the fact that my city is one of the worst hubs for human trafficking, and living here can be very, very dangerous. Despite all this, I've taken pride in knowing that I do everything I can to remain as safe as possible. I've had close calls before. Shady landlord gives a stranger copies of my keys, and a man tried to enter as soon as I was alone. And other horrifying tales, and consider myself an avid murderino. I'm pretty prepped. At the time, I had 2 things of pepper spray, one in my favourite jacket pocket, and one velcroed to my desk at work. I also had 2 trusty pocket knives, one always on me, one in my car pocket door. Oh, and my taser never leaves my bag. I avoid shady situations, and despite being a small lady, I know my stuff. Yay for self-defense. My point is, I'm a very paranoid small chihuahua, and I still get into scary situations. Now on to the story. It's summer, and hot as hell. I've got a date with my favourite gal pal, and I swing by her place to pick her up. She tells me she had a job interview to go to first, and I agree to go with her. No big deal. She's a sweet, tiny thing from a small town in the Midwest, and very new to city life and the wild things that can happen here. As we drive into a different city, I ask her about the job. It's a modelling gig. Oh, cool, for who? I found an ad on Craigslist. It's just sports clothes. The Craigslist thing sets a small, distant alarm off in my head, but I push it to the side. Where the heck are we going anyway? When we pull off to a Starbucks a bit outside the city, the alarms in my head become a little less faint. Relax, I tell myself. I've gone to legit job interviews in coffee shops before. There's always been a good reason. We arrive first, late still, but end up waiting about 15 minutes. Kinda weird. But Kat's relieved we're not the rude ones when she gets a text saying he's here. I look around the Starbucks and outside the parking lot, trying to figure out who the mystery man could be, when I notice a tall, well-dressed man step out of a black SUV. He smiles at us, and he approaches, and I figure that's our guy. I could have sworn that SUV had been parked there for a while. I asked Kat if she wanted me to step in line and grab her a drink, but she practically begs me to stay with her. Okay, I can do that. I don't think it would look very professional, but I don't protest. The man named Jack leads us to an isolated table outside, and doesn't say much about my presence, other than it was okay for me to be there. I get on my phone and shoot a text to my fiancé explaining where I am and what I was doing. He shoots back a "be careful" all in caps, and I sit there pretty to watch the show. Jack had this strange accent that I couldn't place my finger on. Looking back, I'm not even sure it was real. He starts asking Kat the usual questions, and I notice she's absolutely bombing the interview. She doesn't have much experience and didn't bother to bring a portfolio. But despite this, he doesn't seem to care. The alarm in my head is much louder than a whisper, but it completely blares when he asks if she'd be comfortable doing lingerie shoots as well. Dear sweet Kat says she doesn't have an issue with it, but would prefer to mostly do sports clothes like they had discussed earlier. She asks to see some of his work, and he pulls up a lingerie Instagram. All lingerie, no clothing at all. He holds it in front of her face and pulls it away immediately, and when she asks if there was more she'd be doing, Jack goes, "That was it," and hurries the conversation along. He says we need to go right now to his studio at a place he briefly mentioned the name to sign papers and get everything squared away. It had to be done today. He's not working tomorrow, and his co-workers will not do it right. I absolutely hate everything about this, and I'm trying to glare some sense into her, but nothing is getting through. Kat agrees, and he turns his attention to me. Do you want to be a part of this too? I immediately know that nothing about this is professional. I look down at my beat-up docks and green cargo pants, and shirt that has flames and a slightly edgy logo on it, and I can't help but scoff. That's not really my thing. I'm just the ride. He studies me for a few seconds and then says we can all ride with him, directing his attention to Kat. No, I don't want to leave my car. We'll follow you. He looks offended that I butt in, but asks where we parked. Right in front of the store. I got it. I pull Kat up to the Jeep and make sure we walk behind him. As soon as we get into the car, I lock the doors and try to keep from freaking out. We are not going. This doesn't feel right. What about the lingerie? Everything I say she has an excuse for. We pull out of the parking lot, and I follow Jack's SUV. But the whole time I'm trying to figure out how to get out of this. Kay doesn't like the lingerie. But this could be a door for her, she says, and she desperately needs the money. What if it is legit? He was alone anyway. You have your knife and spray, right? Of course I do. But I'm 5'2", and this man's 6'3". And Jack could very much have friends. And I wouldn't want to possibly kill or be killed. I realize Kat is batshit. We drive along as I try to talk to her, and start driving out into the desert, the middle of absolutely nowhere. There's a divider in the road that prevents U-turns, and I get an eerie feeling that Jack knew to take us this way. I'm absolutely desperate at this point. I pull out my phone and snap a picture of Jack's SUV license plate. I upload it to Snapchat, where friends can see it. And Kat starts getting uncomfortable once she realizes how far we've driven. The name of the place he mentioned springs back into my head, and I know it's familiar from somewhere. A commercial jingle that's distant but catchy. It's a restaurant or hotel or something. He wouldn't have a studio there. Please just look it up. So she does. It's a casino. Unless this man had rented out a space, he wouldn't have a studio there. It's not consistent with the information he gave us. Kat is freaked out at this point. I tell her that this isn't uncommon, and that he was trying to confuse us the entire time. Throughout the entire interview, she had a confused and hesitant look on her face, like this wasn't what she was promised or expecting at all. Kat finally agrees that we need to get out of there, and I start to breathe easy again. I notice that every 5 minutes or so there's a break in the medians. It's a rough, quick stop and turnaround, but I'll have to do it. So I do it, and we absolutely gun it. Kat gets a call from Jack, and she ignores it. I convince her to call back, and she gets nothing at all, like the number had blocked her. It didn't go through. I tell her to take a screenshot of the Craigslist ad, but she can't find it anywhere. It's like every trace of Jack had disappeared. We go back to her apartment, and I tell her that she needs to report it. She promises she will, but later, because she doesn't want her husband to know. He didn't even know she had this interview to begin with, and she didn't want him to know what happened. If I hadn't have driven her, she would have gone alone, without telling a soul, and who knows what would have happened. I tried not to scold her too badly, but I just reminded her that our city was very different and much more dangerous than where she's from. Sweet Kat, I hope you're a little more awakened to the world, and I'm sorry for that. It's been a few months since we split ways, and I'm worried over all the oblivious, crazy things that you get into. Since the incident, I now have 3 pepper sprays, 1 for the car, and a new pocket knife to carry around. Thanks, Dad. She's gorgeous. I'm almost 4 months pregnant, and now finally ready to get out of this damn dangerous city. Please, 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 dear listeners, be safe out there. It's such a scary world, and be damned careful with Craigslist. Jack, if you're really the scary guy my gut deemed you to be, I hope we never meet again.
It was at one of the more western sides of the Orange Line, maybe East Falls Church. One of the metro exits puts you right up into the parking lot, whereas they put a long guardrail and bushes to keep you from the very nearest corner of the parking lot. I had parked in that area, I think, and I'd been close to the metro station entrance. When I came back out of the station and had to walk out of the thick bush line, The corner of the lot looked pretty remote and barely lit. I decided to walk perpendicular to those bushes, deeper out into the lot, and then J-turn towards my car. I had spotted two guys hanging around in my travel line that I moved away from and walked on by. They forgot about me and moved towards my car in that dark corner. My car, in fact, a flashy black 300ZX. When I turned the curve position of the J, I saw them. They saw me, and they realized I had spotted them. So they milled around a second time to make an excuse to go back to the center of the lot. I hopped into my car and fired it up, and drove out. The next person to go into the back area, immediately as I was driving out of the lot, they robbed and killed. I got the sick shivers after that. I got back to Reston and heard that on the news. Note, they changed that section a lot and did away with the bushes at the exit after the event. I have a joking phrase I made up for my own daughter, or anyone else. You see what you saw. If someone looks strange or potentially dangerous, it is. Take immediate action to get away from it, like making a J-turn and observing. About 8 to 10 years ago, my family moved into a small house in Beech Grove, Indiana. It was a 2-story house with a basement. Our basement was used as a playroom for me and my 2 siblings. It was shaped in an odd way, almost like a horseshoe. It had a divider wall running horizontally down the basement. One side was a playroom, and the other had our washer, dryer, and storage space. This storage space was creepy as hell, and no one liked going back there. It was straight out of a horror movie, dark, with only a single light bulb in the center of the room, that had a pull string dangling, and warm colors on the walls. The best part is that on the other side of the thin divider wall was the kids' playroom. Anyway, one day my dad gets kidney stones, and at around 9 p.m. or so, he decides he needs to go to the hospital. My mum asks if I wanted to come along with them and my siblings, and I say no, because I'm really into the racing video game scene that I'm playing. So I'm playing my game without a care in the world, and I finish up a race close and whistle to myself as if to say, "Whew, that was a close race." Then I hear it. My whistle responded back to me from the other side of the divider wall. At first I thought it was just an echo, so I whistled something more complicated. Almost immediately it whistled back. I kept whistling and heard mimic responses for a solid 2 minutes. I finally got freaked out and ran upstairs and locked myself in the bathroom. When they finally got home and found me locked in the bathroom crying and freaked out, they believed me when I told them. They tell me Dad has always felt uneasy in their house, but didn't want to say anything to not scare us kids. There was nothing that could be done, so we all went our separate ways to bed. Later that same night, my mother was awoken by my dad swaying his leg back and forth, moving the bed. She looked at him and asked why he was doing it. He said he couldn't help that, and that they were rocking the bed. She asked who they were, and he told her, "The people around our bed. Don't you see them?" She didn't see anything. Needless to say, we do not live there anymore. I come from a chaotic upbringing. I was born and raised as a child in South Korea, and I later moved to Australia with my mother, having lost my father in a homicide. The next few years of my life in Australia were difficult. Meeting and making friends was difficult in the early noughties, particularly since I was quite nerdy, and didn't speak much English, something most Australian kids at the time did not relate well to. One of the scariest moments from my life was when I was aged 12. At the time, it did not even occur to me how close I came to potentially losing my life. My mother and I were on a road trip heading south from Melbourne to stay on the southern coast. We had stopped one evening at a small, well-kept caravan park. The caravan park was quaint and beautiful. Neat grass, nice flowers, frangipanis blooming, and a small creek which ran along the edge of the premises. It reminded me of home. I spent some time walking around on my own, as my mother was taking a nap. I discovered a game and pool room. I went outside and spent probably a good hour playing pool by myself, and generally just mucking around when a young boy came in. I was very shy, and so was he. But we eventually talked for a little while and became friendly. I do not remember playing any games with him, but I do recall him being pretty nervous. He kept asking me if I wanted to go back to his caravan, as his parents were making dinner soon. At first I was not interested, and said no. We spent some more time doing things and talking as it got later. He became pushy and asked if I liked cakes and lollies. I said of course. That much I do remember clearly. I followed him to his caravan, which was much older than ours and quite dilapidated. He asked me to wait outside while he talked to his parents. I waited patiently for a few minutes until the door opened, and a larger, older man with glasses and no shirt opened the door and asked if I would like to come inside for cake. I was scared, but I remembered feeling like I had to, like it would be rude of me to leave. As I was walking in the door, I heard a man behind me shout, "Hey, what's going on here?" I was quickly grabbed from the collar of my shirt and pulled inside. The man then quickly tried to lock the door behind me. However, the stranger was too quick and burst into the door and took my hand abruptly and pulled me outside, and we frantically ran away. The man asked which unit room/caravan I was in and took me there right away. We went inside and my mum yelled at him asking why he was there. I was hiding in the corner crying while he explained what happened. We packed up and left immediately. I was already heavily on anxiety medication after what happened back home, and we never spoke about it alone again. My mother claimed it was something I should talk to my therapist about. Every time we all spoke about it, my mother would leave the room. It scared the hell out of her, and I did not really understand why. I guess at that age it's difficult for the brain to comprehend the reality/potential of the situation. Looking back on it now, it utterly scares me to the point of losing sleep.
This was about a week and a bit ago. I was on the bus from a shopping mall in Australia to a bus stop to which I'd get some food from a supermarket, Coles, and then walk home from there. I was on the bus with my two friends, and we all sat on our own seats, one behind each other. My friends and I are 17. About 5 minutes into the bus ride, this athletic-looking man got on the bus. He was white, mid to late 20s, possibly early 30s, wearing a white and blue rimmed tank top, blue shorts and sneakers, and I think his hair was short and dark blonde. Anyway, people obviously got on the bus. Nothing wrong so far. So we're about halfway to my stop now. About 10 minutes after the man got on, my friend Sarah was napping and Tammy was reading for English, and I was listening to music. The athletic man looked back at us, pretty sure that he was looking at Tammy at first,
my friends and I sat on the left side of the bus, with the man sitting on the right side, probably about 3 to 4 seats in front of us. So I assumed that he thought Tammy was cute. But then I thought, wait, what the hell? She's 17, looks 17, and the man is about 30. The man stopped looking at Tammy, and then a minute later he looked back at Tammy again, just staring at her for a minute. Tammy and Sarah didn't notice. I looked back at the man, who made eye contact with me, and then stopped looking at Tammy. At this point I was suspicious, but I didn't say anything. Then he stared back at Tammy for a third time, this time for even longer. I glared at him because, hey, staring is creepy. To which he made eye contact with me again, and then stopped looking. I texted Tammy and was like, hey, my bus stop is soon, maybe 10 to 15 minutes away. Just so you know, the creepy dude is staring at you. Be careful, in case he's still on the bus when I leave. Just so you're aware, I'm a guy, and Tammy and Sarah are both obviously girls. Tammy acknowledges my text, and nodded at me, and cringed. So anyway, Tammy went back to reading, and I was listening to music. The man turned around and started staring at me this time, not Tammy. His eyes, I saw, were directly looking at me. I tried to avoid eye contact as he turned back around. He kept turning back around and staring at me for a total of 7 times for about a minute each, excluding the times he stared at Tammy. Each time he stared at me, he kept pressing the bus stop button to indicate to the bus driver that it was your stop. And he'd look at me, and he looked like he was about to keep pressing it as he stared at me. I told Tammy again to be careful, as this dude was still staring. So as the dude was staring at me still, I realized the next stop was mine, so I pressed the button. The bus stopped, and I got up and was getting off the bus as athletic dude got off behind me. He went in the opposite direction, but I turned around to quickly see what he was doing, just in case. He was walking down the footpath as I crossed. He turned around and saw me crossing, and consequently quickly crossed the road, paralleling me. I took note and went to Coles to get some Pepsi Max. I walked into Coles and realized that the man from the bus stop was also going into Coles, but he was literally matching my footsteps, speed, and movement. Every time I moved my left foot, he would too. He was staring at me as I walked in, and I sped walked into the aisle to get my Pepsi Max and looked around to see if he was there. I couldn't see him. I walked into the self-service counter and was paying for my Pepsi Max. As he walked past, self-served slowly while staring at me, giving me the most evil glare I have ever seen. I quickly walked out and tried to see if he was following me. He was. He was speed walking to catch up with me and didn't even buy anything. Needless to say, I ran home as fast as I could for 10 minutes straight. He was no longer behind me, and I lost him. I have no idea where he went, and I haven't seen him since. My BFF, myself, and a mutual best friend rented a super old, think in the early 1900s, house, situated perfectly on the edge of the bad part of town, the college-only part of town, and on the way to the good part of town. So it was heavily trafficked by classmates and a big party place. BFF is super into paranormal stuff, but not weird about it. Very level-headed. Think raised in rural Appalachia, and all the folklore that goes along with it. Our mutual best friend wasn't heavily oriented either way, but pretty open to that sort of stuff. I was an avid denier, despite having a few unexplainable experiences in the past. The knocking started happening pretty much immediately, but none of us figured it out for about a month, because we thought it was just happening to us individually. Like one of us would be in our bedroom or the bathroom. It was especially likely in the bathroom door and any door leading out of my mutual best friend's room. For whatever reason, it never happened with any exterior doors, and there'd come a knock on the door. We would shout, "Come in," or "Who is it?" to no answer, just another knocking. Always loud and formal, like 3 perfectly timed knocks. You would call, "Come in," or whatever, as long as you liked. There would never be any answer, and never anyone actually there. I thought it was my roommates just screwing around, or old house stuff. I don't know. I was 22. And the others initially thought variations of the same thing. Then, we were sitting around smoking a bowl one night, and my best friend forever brings up the knockings, explaining what's been going on, and we all look around at each other, that kind of "holy crap, you too?" moment, and we all swapped stories. We laughed, because it didn't really feel super threatening with all of us just chatting about it. My BFF suggests paranormal. Mutual best friend kind of laughs it off and says, "Maybe." And I flat out dismiss it, because no way, and we go on. It keeps happening, mostly randomly, but it's happening now when other people are actually on the other side of doors. So it's not 100% just random hallucinations passing back and forth. On the night it got really overt, BFF and I were just sitting on the couch watching TV. MBF in his bedroom, with doors shut. One of his bedroom doors went directly into the bathroom, one directly into the living room where my BFF and I were watching TV, and a third directly into my bedroom. Think sort of circular layout with doors going through common areas, but also connecting sleeping areas. So BFF and I are in the living room and can see the shut bedroom door of the mutual best friend, as well as the open bathroom door from the common area. We can clearly see that no one is in the bathroom, and can clearly see the mutual best friend's bedroom door. Suddenly, the mutual best friend shouts, "Come in," although we didn't hear knocking. But that often happened. Only the person responding was actually hearing the noise. BFF and I share a glance, giggle, and go to hit the bowl again, when we hear, "Come in," loud and angry from the room. Okay, fair enough, it gets aggravating after a while, but clearly there is no one at the other door, so we don't know why he's bothering to get louder. I'm opening my mouth to shout something smart while looking at my BFF, and I remember this part super clearly because it was surprising. When there's a huge bang, like something heavy had been dropped from a long way in the mutual best friend's bedroom, and it startled us both badly. Then, less than a second later, he comes flying out the door, nearly ripping the door off its hinges, and races into the living room with us. And he stopped at the opposite wall, breathing really heavily, eyes way too wide, and is staring at us scared to death. We are equally alarmed from the first noise, then from the look he's giving us, and then his room. We're almost shouting at him to explain what happened, and he said he got annoyed because the knocking was coming from both doors, from the bathroom and from the living room, and he went to jerk open the bathroom door, but when he started to pull on it, it yanked out of his hand and closed, like way harder than should have been possible. And that was the noise. It also scared him into nearly pissing himself, so he bolted. The knocking continued randomly throughout the rest of our time in the house. Guests would hear it and respond all the time. Eventually, most people who were at our place more than once a week knew the story, and our advice was pretty universal: not to respond to it, but to walk to the doors and open them instead. This wasn't anything clever. We just got super tired of people shouting "come in" from different rooms all of the time. The baby stuff. These ones had a lot more feel of something possibly sentient, or I don't know, more symbolism or something than knocking. It's hard to explain. Hopefully it'll make more sense once I've got the story told. But these stories feel a lot more like stereotypical ghost movie behavior than some of the other creepier stuff that was more obtuse or random. So again, this stuff started happening almost at once, but we didn't realize it because we thought it was legitimate, or that it was just any single of us being mistaken or possibly being high or crazy. It always happened when anyone was laying down, and I never heard it in another place or time. Here's mine. I was laying down midday, about to take a power nap, and heard a baby crying. It sounded very close, right outside the house perhaps. I went into my BFF's room, as it's right beside mine, and it sounded like it was coming from there. I listened, and still sounded right outside, like the window. I looked out of it, and heard it clearly, but there was no source. There was a house right next to us, but the windows were down, and it sounded super clear. Still, I chalked it up to a loud baby and weird acoustics, and thought nothing of it. It happened a few more times, and kept being weird because it was so clear, and more during the day than the night. But I still chalked it up to the neighbours having a very loud baby. I spoke to the BFF about it one afternoon in passing, and she looks and says that she's noticed it too. It's so weird because it sounds so close, and agree that it is weird, and forget about it, because what are we going to do about it? We speak to the mutual best friend. This convo was a bit later than the big scary knocking incident, so he's understandably less dismissive of the weird stuff now, and he agrees he's heard it, so really didn't care to check about it. A few days later, he returns and lets us know he passed the neighbours, who we hadn't met or cared to because we were 22, sitting on their porch, to find out that they were 3 fairly elderly African-American gentlemen with no baby in sight. Mutual best friend paused to ask if they had a baby around or often, and if they heard a baby crying during the day. The men give adamant refusals to both questions, so my BFF and mutual best friend at this point are feeling fairly crazy overall. She's sure it's a ghost, or multiple, but the mutual best friend is sure it's something. I'm mostly annoyed, but also I'm not a total idiot, so I'm admitting that something is weird. So we start asking people who spend a lot of time in the house, close friends, dealers, buyers, significant others, and people allowed to chill at our spot between classes if they're having any of these experiences. Turns out that most of them had heard the baby crying, mostly during the day, and always when they're laying down on the couch or in a bed. Whatever, but no one ever heard it initially while they were up and about. We circle the house inside and out a dozen times while we hear it with different people and different times, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The best way to describe it was if you were standing in my BFF's bedroom. It sounded as if it was just on the other side of the exterior wall to the house. If you went to the exact spot of the house outside, it sounded like the crying was coming from just the other side inside my best friend's room. That's where it was loudest, and no one else could detect it coming any more strongly from any other direction. Weird as hell. In early 2007, I was freshly 18 and newly married, living in Fort Polk, Louisiana, while my husband was training at Fort Benning. I was born and raised in Alaska, so living in the continental US was a vastly new experience for me. My husband had a weekend off, though he was not allowed to leave the base, so we bought a Greyhound bus ticket for me to visit him and meet the soldiers he became friends with. I had never been on a Greyhound bus before, but I was excited to drive through the South and see new places and have my own little adventure. Sure, plenty of creeps bothered me on the bus and at the stations, but I still had interesting conversations, met new people, and generally enjoyed the experience. Regardless of the time, each station we stopped at was open and offered food, outlets for charging, and bathrooms. So when we arrived in Columbus, Georgia at about 2 a.m., I expected the station to be open. It wasn't. Everyone else who ended their journey there had a ride waiting for them. And suddenly, I was alone outside a locked building in the middle of downtown Columbus, full dark and terrified. I didn't really know what to do, and my phone was nearly dead from the long last leg of travel. I thought about walking to a gas station, but I had no idea which direction to go in, and I couldn't see any nearby lit buildings. I truly expected the station to be open, thinking I would stay there for a bit while my phone charged and I had something to eat, and could have access to a phone book so I could call a cab. All I had was an old sign hanging on the side of the building with incomplete phone numbers for taxi companies. The numbers had faded, been scrapped off and defaced. There was only one complete phone number, and it was handwritten in Sharpie at the top of the list. Better than nothing, right? Wrong. I called the number, and a guy answered, casual and sleepy, asking who I was. I apologized, explaining I was trying to call a cab, when the guy perked up immediately and said, "Oh yeah, that's me. I'm on my way." My phone died 10 minutes after I made the call, and it was another 15 minutes before the guy showed up in a traditional-looking yellow taxi. I noticed the cab wasn't marked. No logo, number rates, anything. But it had that taxi light thing on the top, and in my young, naive mind, seemed totally legit. He waved me over. I got in, and asked him to take me to Fort Benning. Finally, feeling some relief. The doors auto-locked, and I will never forget the first thing he said to me. He was silent until we got onto a main road and said, "Did you really think it was a good idea to call a number written in Sharpie?" I froze. In retrospect, no. It wasn't the best idea I'd ever had. But I had so few options, and I didn't want to be stranded in a huge foreign city in the middle of the night. I don't know what else I could have done. After a minute, I tried to laugh it off, and hoped he didn't notice I was shaking. I reached for my phone, remembering it was dead, and realized that if something happened to me, no one would know that I even made it to Georgia. Staring at me in the rearview mirror, the driver told me what was going to happen. There's no use getting to Benning this early. The Post Hotel isn't even open. Drive around with me for a while. Hang out, and I won't even charge you. I told him no thanks, that I really needed to get to Fort Benning right away. Nah, he said, and that was it. We drove to a worn-down apartment complex, where he told me he was picking up a regular to keep me company. I didn't reply. What could I even say? I wasn't raised religious, but I was praying to God for some kind of miracle. Out came a woman who looked a bit like a cliché prostitute. Tube top, miniskirt, smudged mascara, and an unlit cigarette hanging from her lips. Short but ratty bleached hair, pockmarked face, cheap purse, and I have no idea who or what she truly was. But she got in the front passenger seat and lit her cigarette. She turned to me and said, "Don't worry, he's cool. We're cool." Okay. That definitely helped. I had never considered jumping from a moving vehicle before, but even if I wanted to, the back doors were child safety locked, and I couldn't open them. Trust me, I was trapped like a cage animal, just waiting to die. I felt so stupid, so foolish, sitting in the back seat of a cab with no idea what to do, and no idea what was going to happen to me. I kept trying to rationalize it, downplaying the situation in my mind. I was too afraid and frozen to actually do anything anyway. As we were driving around, the girl was telling me about the driver, how he was ex-military and had just started this cab business. What a down-to-earth, fun guy he was, and how lucky I was to be picked up by him. How I was cute and young, and everything was cool, cool, cool. Her words were a bit slurred, and I knew she was either drunk or high on something. I didn't really want to know. We pulled up outside a small blue house sometime later, an hour before the break of dawn, and the driver told the girl to keep an eye on me while he went inside. I'm in full-blown panic mode, the suspense of it all making it so much worse. The girl offered me a cigarette to calm my nerves. I wasn't a smoker, but I said yes. She got out of the cab and opened my door, stumbling a bit before sitting on the curb and lighting another cigarette. She lit mine, and I sat next to her. And I started thinking about whether or not I could outrun her with my heavy backpack, and how long the driver would be inside for. Without me asking, the girl told me the driver was inside showering in preparation. I asked what he would be showering and preparing for, but she kept repeating how he was cool, and how much fun we were going to have, and how cute I was. Then she said ranger cab, because he was like a ranger or something. Or maybe that was his dad. He's a good-looking guy, military muscles. God finally answered my prayers when the girl slumped over and passed out on the grass. I saw the track marks on her arm and guessed heroin. And apparently, the driver was inside taking a shower and wasn't about to come back in the next few moments. I grabbed my backpack and ran like hell. I don't exactly remember what happened after I started running. I know I took off as fast as my feet would carry me, and that I didn't dare stop to catch my breath. 1 minute I was sprinting for my life, lungs on fire, and then I was trudging along with tears in my eyes as I walked through the Fort Benning gate with my military spouse ID, asking how to get to the base hotel. Honestly, I wish I knew how I got there. I was in deep survival mode, and didn't stop to process any of it until I made it to my room. I don't know if someone gave me a ride, if I followed a map, or what. I never blocked a memory out like that before or ever again. I told my husband everything when I finally saw him. He didn't believe me. I probably wouldn't have believed me either. His lack of trust made me think no one could take me seriously, so I never went to the police. I still had the number I dialed saved on my call history. I knew the girl called it the Ranger cab. What I didn't have was the confidence or support to report it. Sometimes I think back to that day and wonder what would have happened if the girl did not let me out of the cab, and if she hadn't have passed out on the ground, and if the driver had never stopped for a shower. It's one mystery that I do not need the answers to.
When I was about 24 or so, I worked at a hotel about a half-mile from my house. My husband and I were dirt poor at the time, so I walked to and from work. I lived in a small town in Louisiana, so things were seemingly safe typically. I had just gotten off shift at 3 p.m. and started my journey home. I had a backpack with my laptop in it slung over my shoulder. I get about halfway home, and this man comes walking up one side of the road. He looks to be about 35 or so, tall and medium build. I keep walking, but I notice he's staring at me. He begins to yell, "Hey girl," and continues to walk in my direction. At this point I'm on high alert and quicken my pace. He is coming from one of the side roads in front of me, so at this point he is standing in the way of me and my house. He begins towards me and yells again. I nod at him. He asks, "Where are you going in such a hurry, girl?" I tell him I'm going home to my husband, which is right around the corner, without giving him the actual location. He reaches out towards me and says, "Why don't you come over to my house and we can talk? Take a break from all that walking." I tell him no, and attempt to walk by him. At this point he reaches out and grabs my arm. "I told you to come back to my house and we can chat." At this point I'm in tears, yelling at him no, and to not touch me. Cars are passing by, and people are looking, but not stopping. I jerk away from him, slam him in the face with my laptop bag, and that stunned him long enough for me to just run away. Along the way he was yelling at me, saying I was an ungrateful so-and-so, and he just wanted to chat. I got home and broke down, and lost myself. I passed by that guy's house so many times after that, and always felt such an intense fear. This story isn't actually about me, but my mother. We lived in Michigan, right in the border of Ohio, so it only took a few minutes to travel to Toledo. Our hometown was kind of a podunk middle of nowhere, so we would have to go to Toledo for any shopping. One day, she went out to this strip mall kind of area, very sketchy but also busy, so there wasn't ever any real reason to worry. She's on her way into a store, my baby sister at the time in tow, and this red panel car pulls up right in front of us, blocking her path to the front door of Target. They slide open the door and asks if they want to sample their perfumes. My mother is 90 pounds soaking wet and way too polite for her own good. She smiles and politely refuses and continues to walk into the store. On her way out, she's walking back to the car. The goddamn panel van and the dirty old couple block her path to the car and slide their door open again. Want to sample our perfume? This time my mother doesn't answer and proceeds to walk around the rear of the vehicle. The man puts it in reverse and the woman asks again, "Want to sample our perfumes?" My mother immediately starts dialing 911 and the van peels out.
The operator had said that they had calls multiple times today about the van, and that there were reports of them kidnapping people who would actually sample the perfumes. This story to this day still scares the crap out of me, not only for my mother's safety, but for the safety of my infant sister she had it with her at the time. Needless to say, I don't think she wants to meet them again.
Every Friday, me and a group of friends would meet up at a friend's house basement to watch movies and just hang out. My house was a couple of houses down in a street that curved slightly, so from my friend's house you couldn't see my house, but it was within the same block. I was 16 at the time, and normally another friend who was making his way home would walk me back, but he didn't go this particular Friday. It was sometime around 9, and I decided to walk back home. Gave my mum a quick call before I left, and mentioned I would be heading home soon. When I left my friend's house, there was a group of guys hanging out outside. I didn't think much of it, since it was normal for people to be hanging out around this time in the area. As I make my way down a couple of houses, I feel like I'm being watched, but don't think too much about it until I'm being surrounded by a bunch of guys who look to be 18 to 21. Truthfully, I didn't know what to do, so I just kept walking and trying to get home as they said things to me and started to get closer. At some point, I stopped scared as they closed in on me within sight of my house. I couldn't even scream of how terrified I felt when I heard a scream yelling for them to get away. Apparently my mum had got a feeling to look out the window, and I am so glad she did. She screamed for my dad to get out, and he did, getting between them and me. He just told me to run inside the house. The creeps ran away while grabbing a metal garbage can top and throwing it at us, landing in our car in our driveway. That dent always reminded me of how lucky I was.
This happened at school when I was 4 or 5. I remember that I spent the day at the zoo with the rest of the class, and we were returning to school on the bus. So the bus finally stopped 3 or 4 meters away from the school doors, and everyone got off the bus to join the class. It turns out that I was the last one leaving. Even the teachers had left. So I was about to enter the school's playground when a woman got out of her car and called me right in front of the open school doors. "Hi, sweet boy. Do you want to go to the zoo with me?" At this moment I had a weird feeling. I knew something bad was happening. How could this woman know I went to the zoo? And why would she ask me to go with her? I couldn't think. I was paralyzed. And she kept inching closer. When she was about 2 meters away from me, and she walked up to me, I felt a strong grip on my wrist, and got heavily pulled into the school ground. I looked up and saw my teacher, even more scared than I was. She looked like she was going to cry. She ran into the school as fast as she knew I could run without looking back. Today, I still don't know what this weird woman wanted, and if she really followed me since the zoo. But whatever. I hope to never encounter her again.
Some friends and I had just got done at a New Year's party and were being driven home by the designated driver. We're all having fun jamming to music like normal people, and we didn't notice a blue Ford Escape that had just slid in behind us and started to follow us until we were already on my street. Not thinking anything of it, the designated driver pulled into my driveway, and the blue Ford had blocked the driveway entrance, preventing us from leaving. We proceeded to calmly all freak the hell out and wonder what this guy was doing. I caught a glimpse of him while the brake lights were still on, and he was a large, heavy-set, bald guy with a large beard. We all sat there wondering what the hell he was doing or what he wanted. He turned his car off, and my friend started to reach into the back seat looking for some kind of defense weapon, to go and confront this guy and see what he wanted. I guess the guy didn't realize that there were more than one person in the car, because he started his car again and drove off rather quickly. I quickly said my goodbyes to my friends and told them to be safe, and hurried into the house. I was on guard watching through the windows for an hour afterwards. Watching, but he never came back. I don't know what his intentions were, but I hope we never meet again. I was 14 when this happened. I had a pretty solid weeknight routine. I would go to practice, come back at around 8:30, and then ride my longboard about a mile down the road to a local Walgreens. I did this so I would have snacks for my inevitable late night of Xbox I had ahead of me. One night, I got home a little late, so I left at 9. I'd been in my new, less sketchy neighborhood for about a year now. I usually ride on the road, but my gut told me to stay on the sidewalk. I hadn't even made it to the main road yet, and I heard a car behind me. It slowed to pace me. I had a feeling that something was about to go down, so I tested the guy. I stopped and did a 180 extremely casually, gave my board a little push and looked over my shoulder. He's reversing. Crap. I dip, fast, picking up my board and go full sprint. I didn't want my cause of death to be wheel bite. I get about a block away and jump into some bushes next to a house, and I waited there for no more than 30 seconds before I heard a car slowly rolling towards me. They pass and turn right. I get out of the bushes and make a stupid move. I go to double check to see if they're gone. I dart across the street and peek around the corner. I see their brake lights, then I see the white reverse lights come on a second later. You've got to be kidding me. I run back around the corner at God's speed, realizing my only chance is to get onto the main road. There's too much traffic there for this guy to do anything. So, I sprinted there at full speed. I figured I got to top speed, and he would have to run me over to catch me. He can't stop his car, get out, and jump me if I'm running at top speed. I made it there, losing him at some point along the way. I don't know when. I never looked back. As it turns out, there had been multiple attempted kidnappings in that area that month. I lived in 4 creepy and haunted houses. They all had some pretty horrifying things, but the third one was the scariest. I was in high school when me, my mum and stepdad lived there. I moved in with them when I was 15. My mum had married him a few months before. Anyway, one night I noticed the doorknob on my bedroom door was shaking, like horribly shaking. It was locked though. I thought maybe it was like a train, but it kept happening. I thought that maybe it was my stepdad being a creep. I didn't know him very well at that point, so I started leaving it unlocked to try and see if it was him trying to get in. It would still just shake. Then it happened. Day, night, any time I shut the door. Sometimes I would get up at night to get a snack, since I have had a hard time sleeping since I was a kid. I'd hear footsteps behind me, or the floor creaking. It was a really small house too, and no one else was up. There's not anywhere to hide. I'd feel my shirt tugged sometimes too, just at the bottom of it, like a little kid would do when they want attention. The scariest 2 things are one morning, it was winter and around 6 AM or so still dark outside. and I was in the living room watching TV and getting ready for school. My stepdad was in the back of the house in his room sleeping, and my mum was heading out the front door to work, and she turned around and said bye to me. And we hear this little girl's voice clear as day say, "Goodbye." My mum looked at me and I screamed, and her husband comes running up, asking what happened. And my mum told him, and then was like, "Well, note to this, bye," and left. Then, the last scary thing was that our neighbour, whose backyard connected to ours, but they lived around the corner, came over to yell at my mum one day, saying that she's a crappy mum for letting our little sister out all night and play on the swing. We had a rope tied to a tree that no one ever used, and my youngest sister lived in another town with my dad, and so my mum was really confused. The neighbour said she would go out for a smoke at night and would see a little girl swinging on the rope and laughing, and she'd see it multiple times when she went out. My aunt works at the city and did research, saying that our house had been moved from another location. It was really old. I don't know if either of these attributed to the little girl or what. This took place 7 years ago. I was 21 and usually more street savvy than this, but was coming off the back of a bad relationship and was going through somewhat of a messy phase. This particular night, I'd made 2 errors. The first was I'd gone out with people I'd class as acquaintances rather than friends, and the second was that I had too much to drink. This meant that the people I was with just left, long before I did. Having had way more to drink than I usually would have, I can't really remember how I ended up alone at the end of the night. All I remember is it being sometime around 4 or 5 a.m. I was outside of the closed nightclub in the centre of town, and it was cold and completely deserted. Not a single soul around. I was out of money and had left my bank card at home, so no way of getting a taxi. And even if I'd have had the money, there was not a single one in sight. I couldn't call for one, as the taxi place was shut by this time, so I was trying to call my friends to find out where they were, not paying as much attention to my surroundings as I should have. And seemingly out of nowhere, a man appeared. He startled me as he appeared from nowhere, and immediately struck up a conversation. Whilst he wasn't saying anything overtly threatening, the way he was so familiar with me seemed off. I was clearly drunk, alone, and pretty vulnerable, whereas he didn't seem remotely intoxicated, and was too comfortable. He was asking my name, and I was stumbling over my words. And when I didn't tell him, he said, "Here, why don't you add me on Facebook?" Took my phone out of my hands and added himself using my Facebook app, and then he had my name. I kept saying I had to go, and that I needed to get home, but he wouldn't let me leave. I was pretty freaked out at this point, and sizing up the situation. There was no one around that I could go to for help. He was well over 6 feet in comparison to my 5'2", and he'd easily catch and overpower me on a good day, so there was no chance of running now while I was drunk and wearing sky-high heels. But something told me to keep it calm and friendly. His friendliness seemed false, and like he would turn nasty at any given moment. He kept me talking for what seemed like forever, and I kept calm while still reiterating that I needed to get home. And then, somehow, I managed to just walk off. I can't remember the moments before. He may have been distracted by a phone call or just allowed me to go. All I can remember thinking, as soon as I'd walked calmly around the corner and out of sight, was run. So I did, as fast as I could, in spite of my stupid heels, which I kicked off halfway down the hill. I'd start crying at some point, and I was so focused on getting away, I didn't notice the two people until I ran straight into them. They immediately asked what the matter was, and I was clearly terrified, and one of them stayed with me while the other double-checked to make sure the creepy guy had really gone. Then they gave me a drink and a jacket as I was shivering and walked me the rest of the way home. I finally managed to get through to my friend who met me at my place, so I wasn't alone for the rest of the night. To this day I don't know what he may or may not have been planning. If it was something really bad, then he didn't really think it through enough, and I had his full name and details from when he added himself on Facebook with my phone, which I immediately removed and blocked when I got home. Maybe he was just hoping to get lucky, and gave up when he realized I wasn't interested. Either way, it was really intimidating, and I've never walked home alone since. When I was 8, my family decided to take a summer vacation and take us to a big famous water park a couple of hours away from home. It was me, my older sister who was 11 at the time, and my little sister who was 5, and my uncle who is paraplegic, and his girlfriend. We get to the water park, and my uncle and his girlfriend end up staying at the cabinas at the very entrance of the water park, due to the fact it was the only place with shade, and he had no intentions of getting in the water with his wheelchair. So they let us go off on our own all day. Big mistake. Since there were only either single or double person tubes, my older sister decided to get on one with my younger sister and let me go on one alone, but just hold on to theirs. And that worked for a little while, but we got to the lazy river that went around the whole park, and at the end of the river they made it like very fast and crazy with waves crashing into you and stuff. I ended up letting go of their tube and flipping out of mine. By the time I even realized I had lost them, I thought it was no big deal, and that I would just find them soon enough again. So, I'm trying to get back onto my tube, and for some reason I just can't do it. A man notices me struggling and decides to come and assist me. I finally get in and thank him and try to float away, but he hasn't let go of my tube. Instead, he starts talking with me and asking me why I'm alone. I explain that I lost my sisters, and he suggests that he gets on the tube with me because he doesn't want me to get lost or drown. I say okay, and we get on a tube together. He starts forcing me to ride all the slides with him and talks to me about how his hotel room is not that far, and he has a whole bunch of toys I would love to play with. I actually started getting really interested, because I don't have many toys, and the ones I do have are broken from my sisters. He says that we can get on one last slide, and we can head over there after. I agree. While waiting in line, he starts acting really giddy and weird. He keeps swimming under our tube and would play with my feet and legs, and told me they were pretty. There was a young couple behind us who was watching all of this unfold, and I guess they could see the discomfort in my face, because they tapped on my shoulder and asked if I was okay and if I knew the man. He tried answering for me, but they cut him off and said they were talking to me. I reassured them that I was okay, but it was seeing the look on their face that made something click in my head, and say that whatever was going on with this man was not okay. Once we got off the slide, I told him that I had to go, and once we got to the opening of the river, I wanted to just get on a single tube by myself, because I needed to find my sisters. He tells me that I can't do that, and he needs to watch me, so I can't leave him.
As soon as he said that, this fear just came over me, and I ducked out of the tube and started swimming. When I looked back, he was right on my tail swimming after me. I ended up swimming to the entrance of the river and got on a single tube which he ended up grabbing and flipping me out of, saying I needed to get on a double tube with him. I did not feel safe anymore, so I ended up running out and running to my uncle and his girlfriend. I didn't tell them what happened, just that I got tired of being in the water. After sitting there for a while, I saw no signs of the man, and thankfully, my sisters made it back to the cabina safe and sound as well, and we all left together.
This happened 4 years ago. I lived in Staten Island for a few years, because I went to college there. I was about 20 years old at the time. One evening, I went to a Need for Speed screening in Manhattan, unfortunately alone because my friend bailed on me at the last minute. I love Aaron Paul and Kid Cudi, and I just had to go see it, even if it was by myself. As some of you may know, Staten Island is part of New York City, but still very far from everything, which resulted to be the longest and scariest trip of my life. When I transferred to 2-to-1 train at Chambers Street, and while waiting for one train, this weird guy approached me and asked for my name. I think his name was Chris. I lied to him and told him my name was Sophia, and kept walking away from him. He then offered me candy, which I declined. This was around 9:30 p.m. or so, and welcome to NYC. The train was taking forever. This freaked me out even more. He would ask me questions like where I'm from, which school I go to, and I lied about every single thing I said. He told me that he lived in Brooklyn, and I noticed another woman by us who kept turning around to see my situation. I decided to sit next to her and whispered to her and asked her to pretend she knew me. She told me how she was going to approach me anyway because she knew I could be in a dangerous situation. So the train comes and I decide to miss it. However, this guy Chris tapped on my shoulder and said, "Sophia, the train is here." At this moment, I got the worst goosebumps and I was sweating so much. I told him, "Thank you, but this is my friend and we're going to talk." I thanked the woman who helped me and hopped onto the next train. When I got to the ferry station, I did not feel safe or comfortable. So I, for some reason, went up to this sweet-looking couple and explained my situation, and they kindly offered that I can sit next to them on the ferry. Fortunately, they were travelling on the same bus after the ferry too. Now you'd think the story would end here, but nay. Remember how this guy Chris said that he lived in Brooklyn? As soon as I sit with the couple, I see the guy walking back and forth by us. I informed the couple that this was the guy who was creeping on me, and I almost started crying. The couple comforted me, and the guy told me that he knows martial arts, which helped calm me down a little bit. However, this Chris guy would not stop walking by us the whole time the ferry was moving, which was about 20 to 25 minutes, although it felt as if it were 300 hours that night. The creepiest part of this situation is that when I thought we lost him while getting off the ferry, Chris walked right by me and said, "I hope to see you again, Sophia." I wanted to legit disappear off the earth at that moment, and the couple told him off and threatened to call the police on him if he didn't stay away from me. Thankfully, the couple and I got on the bus together, and they gave me their numbers to let them know that I am back in my dormitory safe, since their stop was before mine when I got to campus. I asked the security guy to drive me back to my dorm so I was home safely. I really hope to not meet him again. You gave me one of the biggest anxieties in the world.
This happened to me when I was 10. I grew up in a military family and lived in the Middle East for a significant portion of my life. Because of this, we frequently traveled to different countries because of the low cost and proximity. On this particular vacation, we flew into Cairo, Egypt, the kidnapping capital of the world at that point in time, for a long weekend. We only lived about 2 to 3 hours away, and it was a late night, and we were staying at the Marriott Hotel, which had a taxi/shuttle service that was supposed to pick us up. For some reason, our driver never showed, so we were forced to find regular taxis to take us there, which took forever that late at night. We finally found one that was offering us a pretty good deal. They don't run by meters, instead they just give you flat rates that they choose, and headed towards the hotel. Out of nowhere, another taxi basically T-bones us in the middle of the road, causing us to stop. There aren't really defined roads in a lot of Arab places, so it isn't really that surprising that we got hit. In Arab nature, the true drivers get out of their car and start yelling at each other, and that it was each other's fault, and looking like they were going to throw hands. Eventually they got back into their respective taxis and parted ways. My family and I were completely taken aback. We had been in Egypt for less than 2 hours and were already having quite the adventure. We finally got to the hotel exhausted. It must have been 3 AM at this point, and our driver helped us get our bags out and get settled, and told us that he felt so bad about the car accident that he offered to pick us up the next morning and take us to the Great Pyramids, which was on our agenda for a super cheap rate. My parents agreed and decided on a time for him to come, though I can't remember when. Fast forward to the next morning. Everyone is ready for the day, excited to see how crazy it was going to be. Our driver was outside waiting for us, leaning against the car like someone in an old movie, right when he said he'd be there. I'm a blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl that had a deep tan at the time, and being in Egypt, that was a rare sight. When the driver saw me in the daylight, he gave me the creepiest, most unsettling look that sent chills down my spine even as a 10-year-old. I knew something wasn't right with him. Nonetheless, we got into his taxi and headed towards the pyramids. He continued to try and talk to me and joke around with me the whole ride, something I found to be extremely creepy and bold since both of my parents were in the car. We get super close, and there's an entrance that people can go through and walk the long distance to the pyramids, and there is an entrance taxis can use to go through. You have to pay to see them, strange but true, and our driver keeps making jokes about my blonde hair and blue eyes, and bringing up that he could get me into the pyramids for free, so my parents wouldn't even have to pay the extra ticket price. We laughed it off, and my parents paid him and said thank you, and began to exit the taxi. I don't remember how it happened, but at some point after I got out of the car, he did too, and directed me towards his trunk. I was confused and thought we had forgotten something, so I stayed behind as my parents walked towards the gate to get whatever I thought we had left. The driver pops the trunk, and there wasn't anything in there. He grabbed my arm and put a hand over my back, trying to push me into the trunk, and said, "I'm getting you in for free," over and over again, as I resisted. Naturally, I freaked out and screamed out to my mum and dad at the top of my lungs, terrified. When they heard me and noticed I wasn't behind them, they started sprinting back to the car. When the driver heard me scream, he immediately let go of me, closed the trunk, and drove away, just as my parents started to run to me. I was crying my eyes out, terrified out of my mind, knowing that an Arab taxi driver tried to put me in his trunk and drove away the second I screamed for help. It's scary to think what could have happened if he'd been stronger and more prepared, or faster. He's the reason I'm still terrified of taxis, Ubers, lifts, and of any car service of that nature.
I am definitely a skeptic, but one experience I had house sitting for my aunt and uncle definitely raises some questions for me. They were going out of town for a weekend and asked if I would keep an eye on the house and take care of their dogs while they were away. I was staying with my grandparents for the summer, as I usually did, and being a 16-year-old with a brand new driver's license, I jumped at the chance for a few days of freedom, with a house to myself during my summer vacation. I picked up my PlayStation, rented some games and movies, and stocked up on snacks and headed over to their place. The first night there was uneventful, but I remember feeling slightly uneasy being in the house. Nothing out of the ordinary was going on. I just attributed the uneasiness to being in the house alone for the first time, without my aunt or uncle there. Around 1 a.m, I decided to go to bed and let the dogs out in the backyard to relieve themselves before bed. After they were done, I made sure everything was locked, doing the deadbolt and chain locks on the doors. I woke up the next morning, put some coffee on, and got the dogs up to let them out. The uneasiness remained. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched, even though I knew that no one else was around. After breakfast, I decided I was going to go for a bike ride and meet up with some friends. I put the dogs into their crates, locked up, and headed out. I was gone for maybe 4 hours until mid-afternoon, when I decided to head back to the house. When I walked in, the dogs were freaking out. Not your normal, happy to see you let me out the crate excitement, but full-blown panic, shaking and foaming at the mouth, and howling the works. These dogs are normally very calm and are perfectly content to spend most of the day in their crates, sleeping, as they go in on their own for naps. So this was really out of the ordinary. I opened the doors to their crates, but neither of them wanted to come out. Being a little freaked out myself at this point, I decided to check the house to make sure nothing had happened. All the windows were fine, everything was still locked, and the house was completely empty. At this point I should mention how the house is laid out. It's an old house, late 1800s, and prior to my aunt and uncle owning it, it was divided up as a duplex. The upstairs was a separate apartment. They mentioned that an older woman had rented the upstairs while the previous owners lived downstairs. My aunt and uncle didn't rent the upstairs, but didn't really do anything to convert the house back into a single family dwelling. My uncle used the upstairs apartment as his home office, with several computers and a couple of modems, early 2000s dial-up. And most of the time, the door to the upstairs and the enclosed porch off the kitchen just stayed closed and locked. There wasn't really any reason to go up there. I decided, in an abundance of caution, since the dogs were so freaked out, that I should check the whole house. I unlocked the door to the upstairs and went up to check. I noticed that one of the computers was on. This was odd, as my uncle had said in his note that he'd shut off everything upstairs and unplugged the surge protectors. Maybe he meant to do so, but got into a rush to get out the doors and forgot. No big deal. We were expecting storms later, so I shut the computer down, unplugged everything, and went back downstairs, locking the door behind me. By this point, the dogs had calmed down and taken their usual spots on the couch, where I joined them to play some PlayStation. After dinner at around 8 p.m, The dogs and I were still on the couch watching movies and just chilling out, when all of a sudden, one of the dogs stands up on the couch with all of the fur on his back standing on end, and begins growling towards the direction of the door to the stairs. He continued to do this for the next 5 to 10 minutes, and nothing I did would distract him from whatever he was sensing. He eventually calmed down and laid beside me again. A few hours later, at 11 p.m, he resumed this, and the other dog joined in too this time. That's when I began to hear creaking coming from upstairs, like someone stepping on a loose floorboard. It didn't sound like footsteps, just like someone rocking back and forth on the loose boards. Properly freaked out now, I went to investigate. This time I noticed that the door to the upstairs was now unlocked. I had locked it when I went up there earlier. Oh crap, someone might be in the house. I took a few steps back into the kitchen and grabbed a knife. You know, like a horror movie cliche. I checked the porch door to the backyard, which would be where someone would come into to get into the upstairs apartment. It was still locked. Okay, weird. The creaking upstairs was still happening. I opened the doors to the stairs and it stopped immediately. I turned the lights on and ascended. Nothing. I was freaking out over nothing. It was probably just the house settling. It was, after all, an old house. These things creaked and groaned all the time. A little embarrassed with myself for getting so freaked out, I went back downstairs again, locking the door behind me. I decided to get some sleep, popped in another movie, curled up on the couch and passed out. I was awoken at 2 a.m. a few hours later, to the dogs again in full-blown panic mode. This time I could hear them creaking again, and then something else happened. I heard a dial tone. I heard a modem upstairs dial some numbers. I heard it try to connect. Was I still asleep? No, I was definitely awake. I again grabbed the knife, went to the upstairs door, unlocked it, and opened the door. And the noises immediately again cut off. I went upstairs again to check. Nothing. Everything was still off and unplugged just as I had left it. I went back downstairs, locked everything up, and went to try and calm the dogs down. About 10 minutes later, I heard the modem start up again. It would dial, try to connect, stop, and then dial again, and again, and again. The creaking was back too, and this time it did sound like someone was walking around up there, even though I knew I was alone, and had checked every conceivable place in the house for an intruder to hide. I put up with this for another half hour or so, and it didn't let up. The dogs wouldn't calm down either. Eventually I'd had enough. I grabbed the dogs, loaded them into my car, and got the hell out of there. I went back to my grandparents' place, and stayed with them for the rest of the night with the dogs. The next morning my grandparents were surprised to see me there, and asked what had happened. I relayed the previous night's events to them, feeling like a crazy person for what I had experienced. Strangely, they didn't seem surprised at all. They then told me that was the first time something strange happened there, and that my aunt and uncle had all kinds of stories about the place. For example, my little cousin frequently woke up screaming that a shadow man was looking at him in his bed, and my uncle going upstairs to work on his computers one day and discovering that the gas stove had turned on, leaking gas into the house, and all kinds of things had been misplaced or doors left unlocked. I still don't think I believe in the paranormal, and consider myself an agnostic atheist, but I still can't find a reasonable explanation for what happened and what I experienced that weekend. It was all too weird.
This happened on Halloween when I was about 11. My friend and I decided to go trick-or-treating. Yeah, we were a little old, but we just wanted some free candy. I lived in a very nice neighborhood. One of those ones where everyone gives you the full-sized candy bars. So it wasn't unusual to have a lot of people come there for trick-or-treat. However, that also meant that there's about an acre of front yard for each house. So it took about 3 minutes to walk between each door. It was a good night for Halloween weather-wise. Not too chilly, not too rainy or anything. This is important later. So it's approaching 8:30 p.m. and after hanging around on the golf course and appreciating our candy haul, we decide to start heading home and call it a night. The street I live on is a gigantic U-shape, like a little over a half-mile walk from the top of the U down the bend to the other side. We were walking towards the end of the U, further from my house, as we wanted to take the long way, since it was such a nice night. It was about 9 p.m. now, so no one else is really out anymore at this point, and people turned off their porch lights, the universal sign for no more trick-or-treaters. That's when we notice a lone white van parked on the street. We made a joke about how it looks like the stereotypical kidnap vans with the painted windows. That's when we notice it shift out of park and slowly creep down the streets towards us and park at the next house. Oh, they must have kids trick-or-treating. It wasn't uncommon for people to drive their kids from house to house, since they were so spread out in our neighborhood. But given that it was 9 p.m, and with nice weather, it struck me as a bit odd. We checked every few minutes, and it seemed to just be stopping from house to house like normal. We turned around again and kept walking at a leisurely pace, gossiping and whatnot. That's when we hear the car squeal, as it moved forwards down the hill and park again. This time, only about 2 houses away from us on the opposite side of the street. Again, weird time to trick-or-treat, but whatever. That's when we realized there were no kids getting out of the van, not once. Now this was before my first phone, a red and white Samsung Propel since it was 2008. We were only 15 minutes from my house, but a bit disturbed. So we walked to the nearest door and rang the bell, and stuck our bags out in an attempt to act normal. A woman opens the door just a crack and proceeds to berate us for trying to trick-or-treat at this hour, and then slams the door before we could even say a word. Okay, thanks, lady. We turn around, and the van is right there, parked in the wrong direction, on our side of the street. The windows are tinted so we can't even see the guy driving. Trying to keep our cool, we casually walk away from the door and up the street to the cul-de-sac loop that's on the side of the street that makes up the bigger U. If you cut through the loop and hop a couple of fences, you can end up at my back door. The van goes the same way. Now we know he's following us, since there's no reason for him to go up these side streets. We break into a sprint, and I am by no means athletic, but I hopped those fences like an Olympian. We run inside my house, lock all the doors, and freak out while we sit on the front hall. Not 5 minutes later, the van slowly drives down the street past my house. We stress eat our candy, and think of what could have happened if we had not have been aware of our surroundings.
Back when I was 14/15, I hung around with a sizable group of friends. We would meet up in what we called the field, basically a large park in the middle of a residential area which backed onto a cemetery. On one side was an imposing hotel with large grounds, and on the other fenced-in wastelands. We hung around towards the back of the field, which was surrounded by trees and bushes, so visibility was nil from the street. Added to that, it was very poorly lit, so we would build bonfires at night to provide light and warmth in winter. During the day, large gangs of us would come and go. We'd head to the shops or play curbs on the street. A local weirdo would often walk by, looking back over his shoulders at us every few seconds, immediately averting his gaze if eye contact was made. He would shuffle around the corner only to reappear at regular intervals. He was an absolute creep, and this was displayed in his physicality. He was short and of slim build, balding with tufts of long hair creeping down the nape of his neck. As previously described, he would walk in a shuffling motion, stopping abruptly and turning around to watch us. His eyes darted all over the place, and he never made direct eye contact. Being teenagers, and with the bravado of safety in numbers, we never really viewed him as a threat. The lads would roar at him, call him a perv, and tell him to piss off. We gave him little thought. One night around November/December, I'd arranged to meet friends in the field after dinner. Around this time of year in Ireland, it's pitch black by 4, and it was 6:15, and I was 15 minutes early. The field was dark and empty, but with the fearlessness and naivety of youth, I strolled to our usual spot at the back of the park to wait. Keep in mind, this was around 95 or 6, pre-everyone having mobile phones. We had customized our little hut into one of these bushes, complete with branches that we used as seats. I seated on one of them and lit a smoke. All was silent for several minutes, until I heard a slight rustling in one of the bushes. I was slightly concerned, but figured it was a squirrel. The rustling stopped for several moments, but picked up again louder and more vigorous. Definitely not the work of a squirrel. Alarmed, I shot up from my seated position and tried to make out the source of the noise in the dim visibility. Out of nowhere he emerged from the bush. Pounced would be more accurate, and he was mere feet away from me. He stared directly at me, with the most menacing grin I have ever witnessed to this day, and he put his finger up to his lips in a shushing gesture. I bolted, through the bushes, branches whipping at my face, and I stumbled at one point, catching myself before I fell. I ran out of that goddamn park into what felt like slow motion at the time, straight to my house about half a kilometer away. I don't know if he followed me. I didn't look back. I didn't see him again. As I later learned, he spent several years in a mental facility. The next time I heard of him, he had murdered his father, beating and eventually stabbing him to death. He was convicted of the murder and detained in a mental facility. I thought little about him in the 20 or so years since the incident, until a few months back, that he was on my bus gazing around creepily. He looked my way, but there was no recognition on his part. I really hope to not encounter him again.